So, before you watch this video, I want you to go watch part 1 right now. There should be a part 1 to this video that should be coming out. That part 1 is going to be about defining the word transgender. I will do a brief review of that, but I will not be going into the specific arguments and things. I want you to look at that video separately. So for the channel's purposes, at least until given better information, I am defining the term transgender as a person who experiences a level of gender dissonance with their assigned gender at birth. The reason why I am using this is because, one, this definition accounts for gender dysphoria, which we can look at as a form of pathology due to the damage caused by gender dissonance, especially gender dissonance unrecognized. And again, dissonance just means disagreement. It just means an anxiety that comes up. As I mentioned briefly in the previous video, if you can resolve it, great. It turns into synthesis. If you can't, though, it gets into some very ugly stuff. You can look that stuff up yourself. We'll get into that another time. But in this case of gender dissonance, which I am stealing from Julia Serrano, the idea is that anyone who is experiencing gender dissonance is by definition transgender. Why the fuck am I talking about this? Well, it's because your girl saw this and got really irritated by the responses of being posed. So when I look at this image, god damn it, I'm going to fix that. When I look at this, what I see is just a very agreeable understanding. Now, granted, there are terms on here that aren't here. There are probably ways in which you could have a third umbrella for gender nonconforming people. I would think like half the umbrella, like a chunk of the umbrella could be over intersex people, not all the way, but like, again, I look at them as like cousins. I think that they're directly in the same sort of fights for rights and things like that we are. I just have to be very clear. Like, I want to be as inclusive as possible. Gender nonconforming, you're in. Non-binary people, you're in. Fucking intersex people, you're in. Like, you're in. That's it. Because I want a unified form, not only for the sake of people's feelings and need for community. That is, I want them to feel safe enough to be who they are and open enough and have a community that respects that. But I also want, on a political level, as large of a group as possible to meet our sort of political needs and goals. The reason why I think all of these groups essentially fall under this line is because all of our needs are roughly similar. Not perfect, but similar. So like a good example of this is almost every person on here, and the two I mentioned outside of that, have the same needs. The needs for support, the needs for potential medical transition, the needs for some sort of medical intervention whatsoever, the needs for things like hormones, or the needs for rights so you don't get fired for being any of these things. So many of our political goals align that it just seems stupid to separate them. Just hands down, just seems really stupid to me. And so why am I getting flustered about this? And why are there so many viewers going away? Whatever. The reason why I want to put everybody under the umbrella is because I want everyone to be on the same page and have the same protections. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I posted this online and got some pushback for it. I'm not going to say where I posted it, but I posted this online, and one of the things that I find myself really, really concerned about is a lot of people argued that non-binary is not under this umbrella. And I, being a non-binary trans woman, went, no, you're wrong. That's actively incorrect. And the argument was first that genderqueer would be the actual larger umbrella, which arguably, yes, historically, but it's pretty clear now that non-binary has become the catch-all term for anyone that's outside of the gender binary. And then on top of it, we get into this placement of non-binary people who personally do not identify as trans. So the problem with this is a couple things. One, I'm never going to argue with someone about what they personally identify as. If you don't feel like trans describes you, or you feel uncomfortable with taking on that prefix, cool, don't. But for the purposes of political, academic, and medical need, nope, non-binary is underneath there. This is a firm line for me. I know that in the trans community for many years on YouTube, there was a very strong push to argue that non-binary people, or as they were called back then, or still by assholes today, either true scum or trans medicalists or whomever, would argue essentially that they're not, that these people are not really trans, they're just pretending. This is utter horseshit. We know this by data, we know this by every argument under the fucking sun. Right? And by my own definition I've given you, as far as being trans, that is, someone who at some point in their life becomes aware of gender dissonance, that is, their assigned gender at birth is not congruent with their gender identity, which may result in, not does, may result in gender dysphoria. That includes everybody. Full stop. As such, when I see people argue this, I actually really have questions, because I am used to the debates on YouTube where trans medicalists would essentially argue that non-binary people aren't really trans. And I emphatically disagreed with that for quite some time, but I often saw a lot of people buying into this because they wanted to reify or validate their identity. Right? So they would actually try to validate their own binary identity by throwing non-binary people under the bus. We saw this with people like Kalvin, Garrah, and we saw what happened recently when Brennan Beckwith, Cops Hate Mo, LiQWYD, and a bunch of NBs spoke out against the damage that Kalvin Garrah had on all of those people individually and professionally. It's kind of fucking gross, you feel me? Like, so let's be super clear. My presumption on this channel is going to be going forward that non-binary people are trans. If you personally don't identify with that term, that's totally okay. But I do need people to put their big people pants on when we're talking about political advancement. Because let's be very, very clear about this. Besides trans medicalists trying to separate out non-binary people, what other areas in the LGBT or around the LGBT have we seen attempts to separate folks out? Well, one example would be, let's look at LGB without the T, or some of the shit going on in the UK. The fact of the matter is that by definition, right-leaning groups, TERF groups, which are just basically more right-leaning as far as their concerns around trans people are, all of these things, all these groups, have actively made efforts to try to separate trans people out of the LGBT, because they know that a larger amount of us actively and completely makes us more powerful. And they realize that from a certain perspective, trans people are the weakest link in those four, because our needs and wants are different than lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. Not in the sense of being supported and being valued and being approved, but because what we're doing, whether we are just a binary trans woman and trying to pass and all that, or you're a non-binary person and you don't give a fuck about trying to pass as either gender, whatever, essentially what's happening by that is it's causing gender to kind of become fluctuated. It's always been this way, let's be very clear, but in the overall discourse, you're seeing things like, what was it, the Harry Styles thing where he's wearing a dress? You wouldn't have seen that 50 fucking years ago. Like, you just wouldn't. There's a way in which these barriers are starting to break down, and I think we need to continue pushing in that direction. But because of that, the unfortunate side effect is that our arguments are a little bit different than people who are gay, bi, lesbian, pan, etc. And there is a weird kind of debate to be had there, and I'm not going to say one way or the other, but I'll at least explain my understanding of it, is that again, if you take gender to its logical conclusion, which is gender abolishment, or the notions of what is gender and how do you define it, we get into some really interesting discussions. For example, like, does the word gay or lesbian have the same power if we're talking about two non-binary people, right? We know non-binary people who identify as lesbians. They may date another non-binary person and they're still lesbians. As such, the words are evolving to include this much more flexible understanding of gender, at least according to most lesbians I interact with. If you're talking about like TERFs and things like that, of course, they hate the term queer. They absolutely, are repulsed by trans women, yada yada, whatever. Fuck them. My point here is really simply this. While yes, our needs and what we're arguing for is slightly different than gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, etc. people, we are still in the same ballpark, which is essentially that to be who we are and love who we love is a fucking fight, and we should do that all together. The problem is when people start making these arguments of not keeping non-binary people in, I think they're doing demonstrable harm to the rest of the actual LGBT movement, and I think what they're actually doing is trying to reify these notions of gender. And I think that right-leaning people are going to use that division to try to separate us further. Just like with the LGB without the T shit, they're going to do the same fucking thing with non-binary people. And they already tried. Remember, that's what YouTube was like in the last 4 years. So I want to be very clear about this. My understanding is, from a socio-political perspective, non-binary people are trans. Full stop. And the thing that I want to be very clear about this is the definitions we covered on the other video actively support this. But the problem is that there are individuals who personally believe that they can't identify with being trans. They think non-binary is something different. And I think this is utterly nonsensical. If that's how you want to identify, that's fine. Personally. But when it starts to have political ramifications, I get really concerned because I almost feel like this is a form of internalized NB-phobia, where the person is sort of keeping themselves out because they've been kept out of being trans for so long, or kept out of being respected and understood by binary trans people, or, trans medicalist, trans allies, that they basically don't feel like they can be, or they've just come to the conclusion that non-binary people are something different. They're just not. I want this fucking argument to die in a fire. I really would like to get to the point where we just clearly understand and get non-binary people are trans. If you don't personally identify with that, great. Wonderful. Love that for you. But if we're talking about as a political, academic, medical force, as a way to get rights and do things, absolutely non-binary people are part of that. And the idea that we're going to... The idea that there are NBs who are essentially doing the same shift, the same removal that trans medicalist does, is fucked up. And I am not a fan. And if any of these people ever want to argue with me, please feel free to email me or come on chat. Or, I'll meet you on Discord. Let's talk. I'm not a debater, so I'll probably lose because I'm not a debater. But I do want to talk about this because I'm very flustered by this. My partner is non-binary. My kid is non-binary. I'm non-binary, for fuck's sakes. Can we please be inclusive to these people? Like, it just makes sense on a political level. Our enemies actively try to separate us every chance they get. All right? So, if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe. Remember, the comments are set to review, so if you post something fucking shitty, we're not going to allow it. I don't mind disagreement. I don't mind argument. I don't want to see, transphobe bullshit. Right? Or just people just yelling and swear words. That stuff's just going to be deleted. So that's how that is. If you want to support the channel, you can go to streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. That is super helpful, and if you do, you get to see a cute little thing pop up. And If you want to become a patron, please go to patreon.com/transgirltherapist and you can become a patron. If you have ideas for tiers as well, feel free to message me. You can do that through the Twitter account, which is at tgirltherapist on Twitter. So with that said, thank you so much for watching. And remember, this is part 2 of a 3-part discussion, and I'm separating these intentionally. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye.